Welcome to Arts and Humanities are Central. I'm Margie Morgan, Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities, and your host for this exploration of the important role that the arts and humanities play in our everyday lives. My guest today is Professor Dan Herman, a member of the History Department. Dan, welcome. Thanks for taking time from your busy schedule to be with us.
Thank you.
I wonder if you could start by telling us how long you've been at Central and what your area of specialty is in history.
Well, I have been here now for 10 years, and my specialty is everything U.S. before the 20th century, and especially the colonial era, the Revolution, early Republic, Civil War, American Indian history, and then American cultural history. So I pretty much do it all if it's before the 20th century.
And what are your favorite courses to teach and why?
My favorite course is my very favorite course is the American Revolution, and why is because the students enjoy it, and so I have a good interaction in the classroom, and I think also because it tells us more about who we are than any of the other classes. It's about politics, it's about republicanism, it's about the Enlightenment, and these are all themes that I enjoy talking about and reading about.
So that's one of the most popular courses you teach. Are there other courses particularly popular with students that you teach?
There are a number of popular courses that I teach. The Civil War is hugely popular, and it's also one of my favorite courses. And I hesitate to say why, except that, I suppose because I think I have a window into the understanding the Civil War with what I'm going to talk about today, Honor and Conscience, that other professors don't generally give, but so I think it excites me intellectually to teach the Civil War. It's not just about battles, but because it is also about battles, the students find it really wonderful. So the Civil War is another class that I love to teach.
Uh-huh. And have you ever lectured here in the schools, in the local schools?
Well, I haven't lectured in the schools, but I have been part of the Teaching America History grant, and I gave lectures here in the library to school teachers about various facets of American history, including Andrew Jackson and the War on the Bank and the removal of Indians, and also on various topics associated with the Revolution in the 19th century.
These are on iTunes now, is that?
These are, I just learned today that apparently my Jackson lecture is tremendously popular in iTunes, yes.
Great.
Surprisingly enough, I have no idea.
Nice to see history being popular.
Yes.
Now, when I was hired back in the spring of 2005, one of the first things I learned about our faculty was that you had just won the Phi Kappa Phi Scholar Award for your outstanding scholarship, particularly for your first book titled Hunting in the American Imagination. Is that correct?
Right, right.
Now, in my view, hunting is very much out of favor with academics. What motivated you to write this book?
First of all, there are a couple of stories here. First is I was in my first graduate seminar, and I was asked for a topic. I was supposed to have a topic for research when I came into the seminar, and I did not have any idea. So the professor passed on me as he went around the table asking what our topics were, and he came back to me 5 minutes later, and I had to have a topic in 5 minutes. And it just occurred to me that I wanted to do something on game animal representations and coinage and so forth, and then that became my hunting topic. But I also wanted to do something that would get me outdoors, because one of the things that I feared in terms of choosing history as a profession was that I would be locked indoors 24/7. I'd be in libraries, I'd be lonely, and I wouldn't have my outdoor experiences that I loved. So this book took me outdoors figuratively, not literally.
Do you hunt? Are you a hunter yourself?
I'm not a hunter, and that's the other story. I admire hunters, and I also have sort of an ambivalence about hunting. I am a person who actually rescues spiders in my house. So I don't like to kill things. On the other hand, I did hunt a little bit when I was a teenager. I wouldn't really call it hunting. I'd call it more slaughtering small animals, but a few, and felt very guilty about it. But I saw a guy the other day in his four-wheeler. I was out rock hunting here locally, and I saw a guy in his little ATV, and he had his gun slung over his back, and I thought, that's just the coolest thing. That's just the coolest thing. He's going deer hunting. He's, he's sort of the self-sufficient, iconic American. He is part of a tradition that goes back for really 400 years. And so I admire hunting. I like the idea of hunting. I would kind of like to go deer hunting even now. I've never done it actually, but I'd kind of like to. But on the other hand, there's part of me that rejects the idea of cruelty to animals and so forth. So it's that ambivalence that led me to write that book. I actually explore that ambivalence in the book, sort of indirectly.
Interesting. Now, something you just said suggests that there's something peculiarly American about hunting. I'm a British historian. I associate hunting with the British, especially the aristocratic English. So what is peculiarly American in your view?
Right, and that's the most interesting thing about, I think, this topic, and it's why I called the book Hunting and the American Imagination, is that it has played a critical role in defining Americans, and probably particularly men, but I think women to some degree as well. Certainly the aristocratic tradition was carried over in the colonial era. Some of the colonies tried to restrict hunting to the elites. They passed laws saying that you had to own 50 acres of land, which didn't necessarily make you one of the elite, but or you had to have planted 5,000 corn hills before you were allowed to hunt, etc. But there were efforts to restrict hunting, but they were never able to successfully do that. So the right to hunt became, in the American context, a very democratic right that was associated with a broader array of rights, political rights, as well as social rights. And so there's always been this democratic tradition in America. Hunting is very different than in Europe. It is available, it is possible for common people to hunt. But at the same time, there has been, even in the 20th century, even in the 21st century, there is still a kind of aristocratization of hunting. There are attempts to make it something that is closely associated with the social elites, and to restrict hunting rights in various kinds of ways. So there's always been this tension between hunting as kind of a discourse of aristocracy and hunting as kind of a discourse of democracy in this country.
Now, this book was very popular, if I recall. It was a History Book Club of the Month selection.
Shockingly, it was my dissertation.
And you have a second book now that promises to be equally popular, I think.
Right.
The title of this book, to be published soon by Yale University Press, is To the Last Man, a story of honor and conscience in the American West.
Let me correct the title slightly. It's To the Last Man, a story of honor, conscience, and the American West.
And the American West, got it, yes. Well, before we get to the arguments, let's locate the study geographically and in time. Specifically, what part of the American West and when? Okay,
well, we're talking about Arizona in the 1880s. And we're talking particularly about east central Arizona.
Okay.
So the Mogollon Rim country, the Mogollon Rim is a kind of a wall. It demarcates the Colorado Plateau, which covers most of northeastern Arizona, northwestern New Mexico, part of Colorado, and part of Utah. The rim is about 1,000 to 2,000 foot high wall that separates the Sonoran Desert from the Colorado Plateau Desert. And it's along that 100-mile strip of rim that I focus in this book. Not in this book, actually, but in the forthcoming book.
In the forthcoming book. And why did you select this particular area and time?
I selected it for personal reasons, first of all, because I had vacationed with my family when I was a child. We went to see Zane Grey's cabin there. Zane Grey was a popular writer who wrote about this area, wrote fiction about it. Also because there was conflict there, and I, as an historian, I'm generally drawn to conflict. I find that a way to pull readers in and pull listeners in the case of lectures, and to generally understand something that, it's just a window into understanding history, I think, conflict is.
So you're drawn to conflict. So what is the conflict here that you're studying in this book?
And that's the hard part that we both know, you having read the book, we know that it's a very complex book.
Well, let's start with the most basic. Okay. What's the most basic conflict going on?
The most basic conflict is over basically range. It's water and grass. And
water and grass.
Yeah. It's a resource competition.
So we've got an economic conflict over water and grass. Who's involved? Who are the players? Who are the people?
We have a lot of different players. First of all, we have mixed blood people, part Indian, part white. We have whites, of course. We have different groups of whites. We have some whites from the Midwest. We have some from the South or from Texas, a lot from Texas, cowboys from Texas in particular. And we have Mormons coming in from the North and from the Midwest. Mormons colonizing Arizona in the 1870s, and then they become embroiled in this conflict in the 1880s. And then finally we have New Mexicans, the traditional New Mexico citizens who had been there for hundreds of years, and everybody is drawn into this conflict. So it's chaotic, it's confusing. There are a lot of strands to this thing that I trace in the book.
So we've got ethnic and religious conflict here. It's complicated, but what do these people do for a living?
Okay, that gets into why they compete for resources. Some of them are sheep herders. The New Mexicans in particular are sheep herders, and Mormons are to some extent sheep herders as well. They also have a few cattle, but they were mostly farmers actually. And then some of the others were cattlemen, ranchers, and cowboys. And there's this historic conflict in the West between sheep herders and cattlemen all over the West, not just in Arizona, but here in Washington, California, Idaho, Utah, just about everywhere you look in the far West, there's a conflict between sheep herding and cattle.
I see. And did this conflict escalate to the point it gets so violent that actually it's called a war?
Right.
Are you studying a war?
Yeah, it's a war. Traditionally, at the time, it was called the Pleasant Valley War, and a lot of the fighting took place in this one little area. So it was called the Pleasant Valley War, but it was also called the Tonto War or the Tonto Basin War, which is a much larger area than just Pleasant Valley. And my research suggests that this war was really something that had links to 3 different counties, and it was over a very large area, and it wasn't just in Pleasant Valley. So traditionally, a couple of historians have written about this war. In fact, 3 different ones have written about this war, but they have only written about the Pleasant Valley aspect. They really haven't connected it to events in Apache County, which is north and east, and to Gila County as well.
So there had been conflict between the cattlemen and the sheep herders before the 1870s and 1880s. Why did things escalate to such a degree at this particular time that you're studying?
Well, you have these triggers. First of all, there was fighting even before the there was, I guess, fighting in the early 1880s, but it was limited. And 1887, there are 2 reasons that I think things got very fanatically intense in 1887, and one is that you have a sharp drop in cattle prices. Overnight in 1886, because of an oversupply problem, there was an investment bubble in the early 1880s. Everybody was investing in cattle. You could make a mint just running cattle on the free range on government land. And so everybody got into the act. And suddenly there was an oversupply problem, and the price of cattle dropped precipitously, and people were going bankrupt. So that's one reason that things got so fraught in 1887 in particular. The cattle price collapse was 1885, 86. The second reason is because there was a drought in 1887, the winter of 1886-87 lasting until the summer of 1887. It was the worst drought that any of these cattlemen had seen or sheepmen had seen. They had only been in Arizona for at most 15 or so years, 15, maybe 20 years at the most. And they'd never seen a drought like this, and the cattle were dying by the hundreds. And so those 2 reasons, I think, precipitated this conflict.
So the struggle is most basically about grass and water, an economic struggle. It's fueled by ethnic and religious conflict, and other people have talked about this to some degree, but you argue that there's an even more significant struggle going on here, if I understand the book correctly, and one that helps us to understand Western culture as a whole. What is the struggle that's the heart of your argument?
Well, I wanted to look at this thing. I didn't just want to tell the story of the war. That's been done. It hasn't been done in its whole. And one thing I did do before I talk about this larger theme is I did tell the story of the war. It is there. This is a narrative history. It's a blow by blow, but it ties all the different threads together that no one else has done. So. But anyway, what I saw as I investigated, I had no idea that my book was going to turn out to be about honor and conscience. And honor and conscience are the themes of the book. They're in the title. And honor, yeah, well, let me back up a little bit. They're basically two different groups. Yes, there are many groups, but they subscribe to basically two sets of behaviors, two sets of cultural normative behaviors. One is honor and one is conscience.
And tell us what those mean to you.
And I'll describe honor first. Honor came mostly from the Midwest and the South. It came with Texas cowboys in particular. And it was a kind of an aggressive self-assertion. It was involved drinking, gambling, gunfighting, lynching, acts of shaming. I say lynching is an act of shaming. It has roots in the medieval past, for that matter. This act of shaming that's identified with, associated with other things like running people out of town on rails and charivari and so forth. But at any rate, these sort of rituals of shaming, lynchings, come with the Texas cowboys. And in fact, there's a lynching belt that runs up through all of cattle country, where there was a higher per capita lynching number in the 1880s than there was in the South in the 1880s.
Wow. Interesting.
But at any rate, honor is very, it's aggressive individual self-assertion. Right. So it's
very physical.
Very much physical. And conscience is very much honor's opposite. Conscience is an emphasis on moderation, on restraint, on peace, on sort of nonviolence, on rejecting drink, rejecting profanity, rejecting gambling, all these things, which is this conscience nexus of values is associated with Mormons. Not just Mormons, but Mormons certainly epitomize it. And so I see the conflict as being very much between the ideals or this nexus of cultural values called conscience and this other nexus of cultural values called honor, and whose rules, whose way of life is going to prevail in this area. And so that's what the book is more largely about.
Right.
And no one has ever suggested that Southern honor is transferred into the West. I'm the first one to write about that, and I think there's a crying need to talk about that.
I thought that was fascinating, and equally, if not even more fascinating to me when I read the book, is that if I understand correctly, this struggle and this conflict, you argue, becomes a part not only of Western American culture, but of the sort of larger American culture. It gets popularized, even in fiction and films.
In fiction and film, and I have to say, I don't know how much time we've got, but there's one part of this that we're leaving out, because there's also a backlash against honor. Who won the war? Well, you have to read the book to find out. I'm not going to say who won the war, but part of what won the war, maybe it's more a question of what won the war. What won the war was this kind of ethic of, everybody has to be a tough guy. Everybody has to, lynching, that's just, that was kind of a heroic act. Getting in gunfights, well, maybe not getting in gunfights per se, but everybody had to be ready to take up arms, to fight for their rights, to fight for themselves. And that became remembered by Westerners broadly. I don't think just in Arizona, but I think generally the West, many parts of the West had gone through similar struggles. And the way this got remembered was as kind of a heroic moment when we kicked out the bad guys. We got rid of the bad guys in one way or another.
And how does it get popularized in fiction?
Right, and I want to get to that. I just want to get really quickly to the fact that, just very briefly, to the fact that there's a backlash against honor, which is the first governor of the state marries the daughter of the leader of the vigilantes, the lynchers, and he enacts laws that codify conscience. He gets rid of drinking, gambling, prize fighting. He encourages laws to get rid of carrying guns in the streets and so forth. Right. And so there's this backlash. Anyway, but honor is popularized on the American scene more broadly by a popular writer named Zane Grey. Zane Grey was probably the most best-selling author of the early 20th century, perhaps the most widely read novelist in the world in the 1910s and 1920s.
Amazing. I had no idea.
It's amazing. I mean, you can still, not very many people read his books anymore, but you can go to a bookstore, depending on the bookstore, but you can find zillions of old paperbacks and hardbacks too. But at any rate, he built a hunting lodge right under the rim, and he visited periodically for about 10 years, and he wrote 14 novels. He set 14 novels in the Rim Country, as well as many, many short stories. based on this rim country conflict. All of these novels were based loosely in one way or another on this rim country conflict. And in one in particular, called To the Last Man, which is where I take my title, he decided he would tell the story of the Pleasant Valley War.
Oh.
And again, he only understood this as a Pleasant Valley phenomenon. He didn't understand the larger ramifications of it, and he doctored the story and so forth. But he thought he was telling a truth, and his truth about the West was that the Western men were peculiarly honorable. They were men who were willing to fight for their rights, essentially. So they resolved their problems with guns and fists, and not through the law, and not through the courts, and so forth.
Did that become a film? Is that a film?
It was a film. It did become a film. In fact, it was filmed, I think, 3 or 4 times. They had a silent version, then there was a talkie version, and I think there was another talkie version later. But yes, far as starring, I think the one I talk about in the book was the first talkie version, which Zane Grey himself directed, or was involved in the directing of, I should say, in Arizona, on site, on locale. And this was to him the major film that he was involved in. Mm-hmm. And he spent $30,000, he said, in getting this story. He wanted to tell it right, so he went to Arizona to film it.
The project has led to a 3rd book, and I think you've just recently got a 3rd book contract. Is that correct? Could you just very briefly tell us?
Yeah, I wanted to write kind of an epic history of this rim country, and part of that history involved American Indians, and especially not just the conquest of American Indians. These were Apaches and Yavapais in this case. Not just the conquest, but what happens to them after the conquest, because they went to the reservation, San Carlos. They were marched there, brutal, forced march in the middle of winter. But 10 years later, they left, and they came back to the rim country. They didn't have a reservation, but they came back, and they lived with settlers, among them anyway. And I wanted to tell that story too, and I wanted to compare race relations in the Jim Crow South with what's going on in the West, and that's my next book.
Uh-huh. When students ask you what the value of studying history is, what's your response?
My response is that there were a lot of responses. There's so many responses that it's almost confusing to say, but for one thing, historians learn how to think analytically and critically. They learn how to organize arguments, how to argue a point. They learn how to do research, learn research skills. How do we know something? If it's something that happened in the past, how do we find out about it? And then secondly, I think that even though I don't agree with Santayana's line that those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it, I think we repeat history regardless of whether we know it or not to some extent, but being aware of history, I think it does give us a better baseline for understanding how to go about living in the present and the future. So I think it just opens up our horizons. It gives us more to base our judgment on. And so those are the reasons that I love history.
Great. Well, same for me. And I look forward to seeing your Jackson lecture on iTunes. I'm going to do that today. Dan, thanks so much for being with us. Thanks to you, too, for tuning in. See you next time on Arts and Humanities Are Central.